Bonjour, bienvenue sur ma chaîne YouTube. My name is Stefani, welcome back. I love to have you here. If you're brand new, I make videos about language learning, and I also, in addition to giving tips on how to learn languages, I also do this type of videos that I call master guides for different languages. So what you can expect here is a video on the French language, and it's going to have everything from how I learned it to the tips and tricks I have to learning French, certain peculiarities about the language, how to best tackle them, how to overcome these little trippy points that you can expect in your French journey, and just an overall guide of resources and tips on the French language. If you're interested in that, keep watching, and if you like the video, please like and subscribe so that you know when I'm going to post my next video, as I will be doing one of these for every language that I speak. I would love to make these guides to help people that are interested in learning languages on what the best way to go about each language are, because of course each language has its own peculiarities. So stay tuned for more, and let's dive right into the French language. French is an Indo-European language, and more specifically it is a Romance language. But it is a very unusual, I would say, Romance language because it has quite a bit of influences from other languages mixed in there. That is due to the history of French. Yes, it did evolve out of the dialects of Vulgar Latin, as did Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Catalan, you name it, but it also had quite a lot of other influences in it. The origin country of French is France. France was in ancient times known as Gaul, and the Gauls lived there, which are Celtic tribes, and so that influenced the French language quite a lot. In addition to this Gaulish and Romance influences to the language, then there was also multiple Frankish invasions, and those invasions also gave French some Germanic characteristics, since the Franks were a Germanic tribe. So it is quite the interesting language with quite a lot of mixtures and influences, but at the end of the day, at its core and at its heart, it is a Romance language. That is to say, it evolved of the language of Rome, Latin. So why learn French? Every time that I answer such a question, I always like to say that every language deserves to be learned. There's no such thing as languages that are not good to learn. Of course, some are going to be more spoken than others, but at the end of the day, you should learn languages that you have this passion for, because that helps with learning a lot. And of course, for you, passion might translate in this case in love for French cinema or food, or maybe you have relatives in a francophone country, or maybe you want to do business in such a country. So maybe you have that personal thing that you have going for it. But if you are interested in more objective reasons as to the value of the French language, have some numbers so that you can understand better where it is spoken, how spread it is, etc., then look no further, because I'm about to dive into this. French is spoken all over the world in a wide variety of countries. Beyond France, it is also spoken in North America, such as the French provinces of Canada, but then also it is quite popular in the US, in the Caribbean, and also some parts of Oceania, such as French Polynesia, Africa, both northern and sub-Saharan. In addition to France, other European countries such as Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and then there's also quite a few French-based Creole languages around the world. It is also a language that is spoken in Asia, so basically it is a very popular language spoken all over the world. It is the official language of 29 countries, but then there's also a bunch of countries in which it is very popular. It is the second most taught language in the world after English, and so it did used to have a much bigger influence. For example, in the 19th century, when France was one of the biggest countries in the world in terms of population. It has waned in importance today, but still it is very, very big. It is one of the official languages of the UN and the European Union and multiple other international organizations. It has 76 million native speakers and as much as 321 million total speakers that include people who speak it as a second language or third, etc. And although it did win in importance a little bit since the 19th century, it is projected to blow up once again. Some estimates place French speakers at 700 million by 2050, mainly due to the growth of Africa. As I mentioned, it is spoken both in northern and sub-Saharan Africa. And So it's going to only grow in importance. There are certain people that actually think that French might be the next lingua franca of the world. Can it topple English? I don't know. But what I do know is that there's going to be a lot of growth in the French language and in French speakers all over the world, and that there are quite a few bodies that predict that. Beyond that, French is a very important language in business. A lot of the French-speaking countries are quite influential in the world of business. They're quite rich countries, and then there's a lot of business that takes place there from multiple different industries. And also, a lot of French-speaking countries, although not quite as influential in the business world today, are growing rapidly, and they're going to be driving most of the business growth and most of the business opportunities in the future. That involves a lot of French-speaking countries in Africa, for example, when there's more and more investment pouring in. So it would be very useful to learn if you would like to do business with many of the French-speaking countries. Also, French is quite a big judicial language, so in the world of law, it can be quite popular. French is also a very strong language, culturally speaking, in terms of art, in terms of cinema, sports as well. Just think of Tour de France or, for example, Formula One, football, the French Open, etc. There's a lot of sporting events that take place in the French-speaking world. And it is also quite big in terms of the culinary world. In fact, most of the vocabulary in that world comes from French and is not even translated into, corresponding languages. It just kind of is pronounced in French. So if you are in any of those worlds, be it art, cuisine, sports, law, there's going to be quite a lot of vocabulary that comes from French. There's going to be a very strong French influence in terms of, for example, very famous artists, very famous chefs are French. And then there's just a big part of this language that is used in those circles, and all of that is quite connected. And you are going to see that in those circles, French is a very, I hate to say this, but a bit of a prestigious language, because in those circles it is very important. If you're an art curator, you are going to be more successful if you do know some French and throw in a few words here and there. So it is quite useful as a cultural language. But also beyond that, it opens the door to many other languages. And because it is a Romance language, as I was mentioning in the beginning, that does mean that if you speak French, if you learn it, you are going to be able to have an easier time, say with Spanish or Portuguese or Italian or any other Romance language that you want to learn. And if you do plan on being multilingual, it could be super useful to speak French, because then when you know one Romance language, it's just much easier to learn others. A caveat here, it is not the best to start with, I think. If we put aside the fact, I'm attracted to the French language, that's why I want to start there, great. But if you're just looking to start with any Romance language, French, I think, is a bit more challenging than Spanish or Portuguese, for example. That is a personal opinion. Of course, everybody has different opinions on that, but I do think that it is a bit of a tougher language, and we are going to find out why later in the video when I talk about the peculiarities of the language. But in general, I would say that it might not be the best starter language if you're objective about it, but if you're already passionate about it, go for it. And whatever Romance language you start with, there's benefits, because it is going to help with the other Romance languages. So keep that in mind. So how did I learn French? Well, I still haven't stopped learning French. I am still learning. I am not fluent. I speak French well, I would say, but it is not a language that I've wrapped up, so to speak. There are certain languages that I've stopped learning at this point. I do still enjoy the occasional, contact with those languages, but I have stopped consciously putting effort into them. Of course, once you reach a level that you want in a language, you kind of, wrap it up. So with French, I'm still not there. I would like to improve it a bit more before I wrap it up, but I have learned it to quite of a good extent. And I have been through many of the challenges that the French language presents, and I have used many resources. So what I do need is a bit more practice. As I have spoken in other videos, I'm quite a big fan of learning multiple languages at the same time. So of course, that's why it's always like a little bit of, kind of leaving it to the side, learning a couple of other languages, coming back to it. I do that. I do tend to do it. So it's been quite a few years at this point that I've been learning French, because I just kind of get sidetracked and distracted, and then I come back to it. But I do know that I don't really need to maintain, because once I have this language core, it's not like I'm gonna forget. With French, I started with this book. Well, it's a set of books, but it is Living Language French, and it does have several books in that covering different levels, from beginner to intermediate to advanced. And I think it's quite good because I do like to start with beginner books, so I think that this one is good. I have enjoyed it certainly, but I don't think it matters as much whether you pick this one, whether or not. I have linked it down below in this video, and I'm also going to link some other books that I think are good, because there's better and there's worse intro books, but at the end of the day, whatever intro book you can find is fine. Just get those basics. Then I also like some YouTube channels. For example, Easy French. I will always be talking about easy languages, easy French, easy Spanish, easy Greek, you name it. I think that they're great. There's 2 sets of subtitles, there's topics on the street, interviewing different people. They're quite interesting, they're quite good, they're quite short if you just have like 10 minutes to study, so it's perfect. I've also listened to a lot of French podcasts. I find it quite useful listening. It's just usually you can do it on the go. It's perfect for that. And then what I have also done is I have picked up quite a few books in French. I have them right here. Like some of them are, say this one, Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. I really wanted to read this book for a while, and then at one point I was in France in this bookstore, and I was like, why don't I just get this book in French, see if they have it here? And thankfully they did. So I got that one, and this is like a 2-language book. It is Little Prince, and on one page there's the French, the original, and then on the other page there's like a Bulgarian translation. So I'm not always about, you know, having those like 2-language readers. You get the text in one language on one side, on the other side. I actually have, this might be the only 2-language reader that I have. No, wait, no, I actually have one with modern and ancient Greek, but I have not gotten around to it yet. But yeah, I just don't do a lot of books like that, but this one was available like that, so I was like, why not? So nothing for or against 2-language books. I really like parallel text. You can do them if you want, you cannot do them if you want. You can just have a simple one like that. That's not parallel text, whatever you prefer. I like reading quite a lot. So something else that I have is I have also like this little grammar of French that I just kind of got alongside my living language a few years ago, so I do like to look it up. I have this video on grammar, which I'm going to also, it's gonna pop on the screen here, that I made how grammar is not necessary. If you want, you can check that out. And I don't believe that grammar is vital, but I do enjoy grammar, so I do have that. And I've also used, I'm also currently actually using this other grammar that is comparative grammar, French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese that I really like, that I'm also going to link down below. And that's the other book that I like with French. But in general, I have been, you know, I'm kind of past the book level at this point, at least like in terms of grammars and intro books. And I'm mostly focusing on kind of reading books in the French language, watching movies. I watch quite a lot of movies and TV shows in French. Then listening to podcasts, I do a lot of that. And then whenever I go to France, I try to practice my French. Whenever I get the possibility to speak, I speak. So what resources do I recommend for learning French? You can use the book that I used, the Living Language Introductory Book to the French Language. I think it's great. It's called actually the complete course, but it does cover a lot. It's not complete in the sense that you're going to be fluent in French once you finish it, but it gives a very good overview of the language. And you can just skip the parts that you don't like. It's no big deal if you don't do a drill, if you just go through the listening, the dialogues, and you kind of see the new words, and then you don't want to do the drill. It's fine, you know, just pick whatever you like, but try to at least go through like the little notes that they have there. You can also use other books. As I mentioned, there's going to be some link to the description. Now you can also get your basics otherwise through YouTube channels. As I mentioned, I am a fan of that. You could use apps to get your basics, just anything to kind of get your feet wet into the French language. Another very good resource are books. I shared some of mine. You could literally pick on any topic that you want. Very popular in some language learning circles is the use of books that are written for children, which are, old people tend to think they're simpler. I don't believe they are, because I don't know, who needs to know the names of all the animals in any language that they're learning? That's not the first place you should start, right? Also, It depends on what you like to read, but for many adults, children's books are quite boring, so they're not going to be ideal for that. So I say pick something you're genuinely interested in and you genuinely want to read. Like my example with Stephen Hawking's book. I really wanted to read that in general. I wasn't thinking I'm going to read it in French. I just ended up buying that in French. I ended up buying a book on Norse mythology in German. You know, you get my drift. Whatever your interests, get a book on that. It's better with non-fiction books, especially when, you know, fiction is for kind of higher levels. Yes, you saw The Little Prince, but that is quite simple in terms of the way it is written. And it works. Even if you're intermediate in French, it's gonna work. But fiction can be super flowery in terms of language. It can be quite complicated. It can use a lot of constructions that are super formal and that lend themselves great and beautifully to fiction, but nobody speaks like that in real life. So if you want to dive into fiction, I would recommend to save it for later, because there's a very big chance that you might get frustrated if you're an intermediate learner and you pick up a fiction book. It's super hard. When I read fiction in my own native language, I encounter words that are archaic and out of use and I don't know them, and I usually ask my grandmother, what does that word mean? Imagine, in my native language. Now imagine that in a foreign language. That's, you know, so fiction is a bit tricky. But if you really want it, go for it. After all, language learning is a personal path and it's about joy. If you don't feel joy, you're going to give up quickly, because it's not a good, it's just no way to sustain it in the long term, unless you feel joy when you learn. So I recommend that. I recommend books on topics that you like. Books are far from your only option. There's also quite a lot of TV shows and movies that you can enjoy. There are several. For example, on Netflix, there are several originals that are in the French language. Then there's also the history of French film is quite strong. Modern French film is as well. But I remember, especially when I was a kid in Bulgaria, there was so much French film on TV. It was dubbed in Bulgarian, unfortunately, so you cannot really enjoy it fully that way. But there's a lot of old French comedies that are very popular here, and I've kind of seen a lot of them in Bulgarian thanks to that. But you can also watch them in French so that you get some practice. In general, French cinema is quite renowned. And then there's a lot of contemporary stuff as well, a lot of TV shows. Just look around. It is, as I've mentioned actually before, a very good option is Language Reactor, because it actually gives you this opportunity to add more to, for example, language learning or Netflix, right? If you are using Netflix, then there's Language Reactor is very useful because it gives you the catalog of everything that is available in French. It gives you like subtitles that you can download as a text. It gives you like subtitles in French and then in our language of your choice, and you can click on every word and it's going to translate it for you. So it's a very good tool. If you use Netflix, give that one a try. If you get your movies elsewhere, then I'm sure that you're going to be able to find French ones, because it is actually, thankfully, it is not that uncommon. It is not a very niche language that is very hard to find resources for. For French, there's a lot of TV and a lot of movies. Something else that could be quite fun is French music. It really depends on your own musical preferences and whether you like it or not, but there's quite a lot of French music. It is also music that is famous worldwide, so you've probably heard some of the big names already. It's probably not that hard to find and to enjoy. Language learning with music is something that is very good to do, because music taps into emotion and it is just much easier to remember words and phrases when you're listening to music. So check that out. Another thing that is auditory are podcasts or listening to the news in French. There's many podcasts in French. I'm gonna give some examples in the description below. I think that there's a lot of good ones, like just off the top of my head right now, Inner French, or then there's like News in Slow French, there's France 24 News, there are, what else, One Thing in a French Day. It's just quite a lot. If you want to find French podcasts, one of the easiest ways that I know how to do it, and I've mentioned in other videos, is using Castbox, because on Castbox you can search by language or by country. I forget which one it was, but it is much easier to search than, for example, on other podcast platforms where you would need to change your entire country of your account, like on Apple platforms or in other podcast providers. Again, you cannot search by country or by language, but on Castbox you can, and you can use that to find podcast that you're interested in, and then you can continue to listen on Castbox, or you can just type in, now that you know the name of podcast, you can just type it in your other podcast provider that you like to listen to. I mentioned the news already in podcasts, but you can also listen to news on French radio. Thankfully, you can just type in French radio online. You're going to come up with so many different options. You can also read the news, and I'm going to link some French news websites in the description. Most of us get the news on a daily or a weekly basis and are in touch with the news in some form or another. So why do it in your native language? Why not do it in French? And I am going to link some suggestions down below of websites that you can check out, and of course there's some podcast, radio, whatever you want to do. Unfortunately, if you do like a certain brand of a news provider, it is not very likely that you're going to be able to find it translated in French. I'm saying that because in my last video, when I was doing a master guide of the Spanish language, I was actually talking about how in Spanish, there's many websites like CNN, the New York Times, BBC, whatever, that actually have translations of their core news, their core website in Spanish. And so that's great. With French, I don't think there's as many options, but you can find local newspapers that are just as good. Another great way to learn is through people. You do not have to speak to native speakers. There's a lot of techniques of shadowing, of self-talk, of just thinking in another language or writing in another language. All that is a form of input. But if you also want to engage with French native speakers, I think that is wonderful. If you have the opportunity to do that, there's French people all over the world, especially in more metropolitan cities. You're undoubtedly going to find some French speakers. There's a lot of language exchange apps as well, or a lot of apps that are actually going to be about, you get a teacher in a certain language and you pay by the hour, whatever you want to do, you can do that. Another thing that is very good with French in particular is learning through travel. Because if I'm not mistaken, I believe that France is the #1 destination for tourism worldwide. I read that a few years ago. I'm not sure if it's still true, but in any case, France is huge in tourism. And so I'm sure there's many places you want to visit. So if you have the opportunity to do that, it's a great way to get inspired to learn French, of course, because it plays into such an important part of language learning, that is inspiration. But then beyond that, it's also a great opportunity to practice. So yeah, take advantage of that, because I believe that there's many places in France that are on the bucket list of so many of us. So go ahead and do that. France is great for tourism. And another thing that France is great for is cooking. French cuisine, I'm not gonna lie, is my favorite. Well, there's a couple of others that are occupying my #1 spot along with French, and I cannot decide which one I like the most, but French is one of my #1 cuisines. I love it. I think it's amazing, and I think it's also a great way to learn through cooking, because I've actually done it, and I think it's very useful. I wanted to make French onion soup, and I found the recipe in French, and it's just so inspirational to cook and then learn at the same time. And recipes are a great way to learn, in particular with French. It is great because it is actually a very strong culinary tradition. I think many people love the food. And so connecting the passion for cooking with learning the French language can be very, very useful. And it can improve retention, and it can improve how much you remember of the language, because when you connect what you're doing with what you're learning and with something you're passionate about, it can be very useful. So if you like to cook, check it out. And last but not least, one more tip on learning French can be to just use the vocabulary of other languages that you know. There's so many cognates in English, for example, because so much of the vocabulary of English was influenced by French, and there were a lot of words that were borrowed from French. If you speak another Romance language, it can also be super useful. Just look for those cognates. Of course, there can be false ones, so pay attention to that. But in general, you can use other languages to improve your French vocabulary and to improve it in a way that is faster and efficient. So take advantage of that. So what are some of the idiosyncrasies of the French language? #1 is pronunciation. I find French pronunciation very difficult. That might not be true for you. I don't know why. That is, I think, well, of course, there are some sounds that are super difficult that are, I guess, absent in my native language. Maybe that's why. I have always found the pronunciation of certain languages easy or difficult right off the bat. Spanish, Greek, Russian, super easy to pronounce for me right off the bat. I could even get the accent sounding native-like really quickly. With French, I have studied it for a while. I'm already very good with it in general, but my pronunciation is still not great. I'm not worried about that. In general, I don't worry about pronunciation. I don't worry about accent. Well, I worry about pronunciation, much more about accent, in terms that I want to be understood. But if I'm understood, I don't need to sound French. I just don't bother with that. But French pronunciation is something that, even if you are not perfect like I am, I'm just not perfect in it, is difficult, yes, but it's something that you can get used to. It's not impossible. So I just want to point some things out. It is very monotone, and there's a lot of different French accents, and there's a lot of sounds, like nasal sounds in the French language. There's a lot of sounds that don't exist in other languages. There's that very peculiar French R. There's also a lot of like different pronunciations of one single letter, like for example, the letter E. It has so many different sounds behind it, and there's so many different accents that you put in French, which can influence French writing, but it also influences French pronunciation. And one letter can be pronounced in so many different ways. There's many combinations and clusters of vowels that can sometimes, they just lead to one sound, but they're just this cluster, and you need to know how to pronounce it. And there are so many letters in French that are written on the page, but you pronounce very few of them. So there's this difference there, because in Spanish, for example, or Italian, you kind of tend to pronounce every single letter. In French, you do not. Probably half of them are not pronounced, and that is quite tough. So that means that you're going to need to be doing a lot more listening for French than you are going to be, for example, I don't know, German, Spanish. You're not going to need to listen as much in order to be able to understand. But because the French language, as I said, is just tough pronunciation and tough sounds and very monotone and very kind of like eating a lot of the I don't know if you can say that in English, but just, yeah, like skipping a lot of the sounds and vowels and kind of shortening and chopping them up, and then connecting in this one huge line of monotonicity. And it's tough. It's a tough pronunciation, and it requires more listening to get used to, and just more exposure, but you are gonna get used to it. Just don't give up and keep trying. French pronunciation is difficult to understand, it's difficult to reproduce, it is difficult all around for most people, not saying for all, but for most it is, but it's a matter of exposure. Because right now I am for example, it's easy for me to understand. In the beginning it was impossible. I could only understand like written French. I could not understand what I'm hearing. Now I can understand what I'm hearing. And my pronunciation is still not perfect, but do I care? No. And at the end of the day, it's about it being good enough. So don't stress too much over it. Just get used to it and take it one step at a time. Remember when I said that many of the letters in French are not pronounced? Well, the effect of that is that in French, there's something that's called the liaison. That happens when a word ends in a silent letter, which you wouldn't pronounce in general, like nous, for example. You don't pronounce the S at the end of that word. But when that word is followed by another word that actually begins with a vowel or a silent H, and I'm going to talk about the silent H in a minute, then what happens is that those words get connected. In that letter, the S in nous, for example, that was not pronounced until now, when it's followed by this word that begins with a vowel or silent H, it becomes pronounced and it links to the other word, and it actually feels almost as if it is part of the other word. That's how it sounds like. For example, nous allons or comment allez-vous. And comment is usually, you don't hear the T, but in comment allez-vous, it is pronounced. And that is quite difficult to get used to in the beginning, but trust me, once you've listened to enough French, it becomes super automatic and you don't have to ever think about it. So this is something that can really put you off in the beginning, but it's not a big deal. For sure, it's not one of the biggest deals of French. You are gonna get used to it. The letter H in French is usually not pronounced, but it can act in different ways. Sometimes it can act as silent or mute letter, and other times it can act as an aspirated letter. Now you don't pronounce it, but it changes how that word is going to interact with other words, and whether there's a liaison or there's not a liaison, and whether you write the definite article with a contraction. So For example, the silent or the mute H in the word l'homme, it's, as you can see, this word is written with this apostrophe, which is like usually what happens before a vowel. The H is not pronounced and it's acting as if it were a vowel. And it is different in other cases, such as le homard. Le homard is a word that also has this H that is not pronounced, but as you can see, it has the full definite article, and there's no liaison with that word, and there's no contraction of definite article with that word. And this is one of the tough ones of French, because it can be very difficult to know which words are silent, which words are with an aspirated H. I would not recommend studying long lists of words, because this is not going to help you when you're speaking. You cannot go through these lists in your head. It just has to come out naturally, like most things in languages. So I have 2 tips for you. Tip number 1 is, if you actually speak a Germanic language, and preferably one that is not English, because you cannot notice too many of those words with English. But if you speak a Germanic language, you would know that le homard is actually a word that comes from the Germanic languages. It has a Germanic word. You're gonna know that it's a word that exists in very similar form in Dutch, for example. And so a lot of those Germanic words are gonna have an aspirated H, and they're not gonna require liaison. They're not gonna require a contraction of definite article or any of that. A lot of those aspirated words, not all, but most of them are actually not Romance in origin, but mostly Germanic. Whereas a lot of the mute words are actually going to be, native French, so to speak, as in not influenced by Frankish invasions, but mostly of Latin roots. And it can be very useful if you speak a lot of languages. You're probably going to know the roots of words. You're probably going to know what word is Germanic word, what not. If you are, I don't know, a German speaker, for example, or a Dutch speaker, Swedish, whatever, it's also going to be easy for you. Why I'm saying English might not help a lot is because in English, there's so many words also of French origin, so it's just this mess. But if you speak a Germanic language that is not as influenced by French, you are going to be able to see which words in French actually came from Germanic languages. So, number 1. Number 2, if you don't know any of that, then I would say to just pay attention. Just notice. Whenever you hear a word that begins with an H, notice. Oh, was there a liaison with the other word, or was there not? Or when you see it written, it's even easier to see, right? But when you're also listening to spoken French, just try to notice, and just, you're gonna get used to those words, and through a lot of exposure, through a lot of reading, listening, watching TV, at the end of the day, you're gonna be able to come across the words that you're usually gonna use, and that you're gonna know what those words are effortlessly without having studied huge lists. So I think it's very important to cultivate this ability to notice, and that is what's gonna help you with these words, because trust me, learning them by heart is not gonna help. Or at least not in the long term, and it's not going to help you be a fluent speaker. It's just going to give you this rote knowledge that you might or might not be able to put to good use. So if you want, look at those lists, but don't be so hell-bent on memorizing them. Try to give it time and it'll stick. So the verb conjugation of French is something that, depending on your need for the French language, what you want to use it for, what your goals are, can be easy or can be difficult. Of course, it's going to be more difficult than English, because English just has very little conjugation in terms of like the differences between I go, you go, he goes. Not much difference. But in French and in most other languages, there's going to be more differences depending on what person, and is it singular, is it plural, etc. In French, the good news is that if you don't plan to be writing much in French, you don't need to worry that much about conjugation. But if you do plan to write a lot, then there's going to be quite a few differences. Here's what I mean. If you just want to speak French and you're not very concerned whether you're writing correctly or not, then you're going to be able to have a very easy time with French conjugation. Let's take the verb manger, for example, which is a regular verb. So, je mange, tu manges, il mange. Mangeons, vous mangez, il mange. As you can see, with the exception of nous and vous, everything else is pronounced the same way. It is written differently, which is why I said if you want to write well, it could be a problem. But if you just want to speak, conjugation is very easy. So it's not as hard as you see, because there's so many differences. As I mentioned, French, like a lot of stuff are written and not pronounced. So it's not going to be very difficult for you to conjugate if all you're interested in is speaking. And there's even another way to make this more easy. On est and nous sommes are the same thing. They both mean the same thing. They both mean we are. But for on est, it's like you don't need to learn another conjugation. You can just use the third person conjugation, which, surprise, surprise, for many verbs, it's exactly the same in terms of pronunciation as first person singular and second person singular. There's gonna be so much you can do, because like I said, first, second, third person singular in French and third person plural sound most of the time the exact same way. So you're just going to be able to learn that and learn the vous. You don't need to bother with nous if you want to be super efficient and quick. You can just always say on est, or, you know, whatever other verb, and that's it. And it's a similar concept. It also exists in other languages. For example, in Portuguese, you can say a gente, and then you use the third person singular conjugation, and you just don't bother with the first person plural. So you can also do that if you want. Of course, in French, there's going to be many verbs that are irregular, but that is the case in any language I've ever learned, so I don't think it's a peculiarity of the French language. Yes, there's irregular verbs. Yes, there's exceptions. I mean, that exists everywhere. What is a bit interesting is also irregular adjectives in French, because usually adjectives, articles, nouns, pronouns, everything has to kind of conform to gender. In French, there's two genders, masculine and feminine, so everything has to conform to that, including adjectives. And so there are some that are irregular, such as beau, belle, for example. That is not the usual, which is usually to just add an e and make an adjective feminine. And sometimes letters double the consonant, I mean, sometimes not, but in general, that's the usual way that you form it, like content and contente, and then the t ends up getting pronounced here, but usually it is silent in the masculine, it's pronounced in the feminine. And so a lot of French adjectives works that way, but then there's also some, like the example I gave of beau and belle, that actually are irregular, but there's not too many of them, I would say, and irregular adjectives are a little bit of a feature of the French language. Again, you're gonna come across them, notice them, don't worry too much. Something that is always, a topic when it comes to Romance languages is the subjunctive. It is also present in French. It is something that is barely there in English. There's very few uses of the subjunctive, old traces of it, but in French it's used quite a lot. To give a very quick overview, a huge oversimplification of the subjunctive, because it requires another lesson on its own. It is usually used in kind of wishful thinking situations, when you're expressing a wish, a hope, a fear, some uncertainty, anything like that, anything that is not a statement, matter of fact. Again, oversimplification, but that is usually what a subjunctive is used for. Again, with French, it is something that is more common than in English. As I said, in English it's barely there, but it's also present in the other Romance languages. I advise you, if you speak a Romance language, just Google the differences between that language and French in the use of the subjunctive, because there's not going to be that many differences, I promise you. If you don't speak another Romance language, notice the use. Again, very important to notice, because if you memorize all the cases in which a subjunctive is used, it is very unlikely that it's going to flow out of your mouth when you try to speak to a native speaker. So instead, try to see where it's used. Right, where do people use subjunctive in French? Try to hear it, or when you're reading, for example, the news or a book or something, try to notice and just take note and be like, oh, okay. After a while, all of those phrases that are going to use the subjunctive, they're just going to come out of you naturally. It's called chunking, this kind of learning certain phrases and then using them to create other phrases. And that's going to happen naturally. The subjunctive is going to come easily one day, I promise. In the beginning, it seems like it's not. I certainly felt that way in the beginning. Well, I did with Spanish, because Spanish was my first Romance language. But trust me, once you get used to it, it's just gonna come out naturally. The important thing is to notice which cases the subjunctive is used for. Pay attention to it. Once you know it's there, once you've read through, oh, okay, so this is what the subjunctive is and this is when it's used, don't try to memorize the uses, just be aware, and from then on you're gonna know to look out for it, and you're gonna be able to just get used to it. Something very interesting in French is the way that they count. And numbers in French are influenced by the goals, because the goals used to count in 20s. So there's going to be a lot of interesting things you hear in French, like 80, which is 80, or 99, which is 99. Literally translated, 99 in French is 420, 10, 9. So numbers in French require quite a lot of, I would say, math when you do them. And that's very weird when you first see it. If you totally want to avoid that, you can pretend that you're speaking Swiss French or Belgian, or there are a few other varieties that actually have different words. So instead of the classical numbers that I just described, that they're done like after 60, there's just all this counting and math involved. And it is the same way in France, for example, it is the same way in Canada. But in some European countries, and I think in some African countries as well, people count differently. For example, they would not say 90 for 90, they would say 90, which is much simpler. So if you want to avoid those numbers, you can try to learn, the accents, the varieties of French of those other countries that don't count like that. But I actually think that those numbers are quite fun. It's one of my favorite things about French personally. So I'm just pointing them out here as a peculiarity, something to pay attention to, because you're going to need to do a lot of mental math when you speak and you try to use numbers in French. So just keep that in mind. Something else that is very different from English is the gender of possession. So in English, his or her, it's about who is speaking. So it's always going to be, when you're talking about a woman, it's always going to be her book, her car. In French, it's always about the noun, the object that is being possessed. It's not about the speaker. So it's sa voiture. And that means her car or his car. It depends on the context, you're going to be able to figure that out. But it's sa and not son, because voiture is feminine and not masculine. So that is a little bit something to keep in mind when it could be a mistake in French, especially if you're an English speaker and you're used to kind of using those possessives in accordance with the person that is the possessor. No, in French and in other languages as well, it is actually about the thing that is being possessed. So how about a similarity between French and English? Well, neither of them are proverb languages. That could be very useful for some of you Romance language speakers out there. For example, if you speak already Italian or Spanish and you're used to that, you can just drop the pronoun. In French, it doesn't work that way because, as I mentioned, there's many verbs that are pronounced the same way. Like je mange, tu manges. How am I gonna know who's doing the eating if we don't have those pronouns? So in French, you always need to say that. You cannot just say mange. No, it needs to be je mange, il mange, elle mange. It is a language that retains the pronouns. So there's one similarity with English, and something that is going to make French a little bit easier for you if you're an English speaker, because this is going to be something that you're not going to be wondering about and conjugating too much, and do I drop the pronoun, do I not, as in other languages. It's just always use the pronoun in French. There's also quite a few of irregular plurals in French. They also exist, of course, in other languages. Think of English with mouse and mice, etc. But why I want to speak about this in French is because there's actually some patterns. So there are some adjectives that are just not following any patterns, like ir and you, is. But besides those super irregular ones where you just don't know what's going on, there's those that follow a pattern. So they're irregular, but they follow a pattern, like cadeau, cadeau, or cheval, chevaux. And so there's patterns like that are quite repeated in the French language. So whenever you see an irregular adjective, I would advise you look up the patterns. There are several patterns in the French language about irregular formation of plurals, and you are going to be able to see what those patterns are. So that's going to make you feel much calmer when you're using plurals in French, because there's not as many that are completely irregular and follow no pattern. There's actually quite a few that even in their irregularity, they follow a pattern. So look that up. And in general, of course, plural in French is formed by adding an S, and that is quite simple, works like in English, but it is useful to look up some of those patterns for irregularity so that you are calmer when you're studying the language. So adjectives in French are something that we've already touched upon and are quite interesting, but I also wanted to touch upon one more thing about adjectives, and again about noticing, because all of this whole thing of just a quick overview of the French language's peculiarities is so that you can be aware of them and you can notice them in a sentence, not learn the rules by heart. That being said, adjectives are actually, usually they follow the noun, sometimes they come before the noun. And the adjectives that come before the noun, I have many times seen them summarized as bags, so beauty, age, goodness, and size. And it's very difficult, like for example, to think, oh, is this jeune? It's an age adjective. Okay, so it comes before the noun. It's a little bit difficult to think like that when you're speaking because the speech needs to come out quickly. So I would advise take a look at those adjectives that usually come before the noun to just be aware that they exist and that they fall into its centered categories. But then after that, don't try to memorize which ones come before the noun, just pay attention. Again, the theme here is pay attention, be aware, be cognizant. Whenever you see them in a word, take a mental note. Oh, so the word beau comes before the noun. Okay. Or the word grand or something like that. Just take note of that. And then after a while, you're going to be able to place them before or after the noun just very quickly. Again, remember, most adjectives come after the noun. Another peculiar thing about French is the partitive. This is something that is best explained through examples instead of like complex grammar, but in general, it is de plus the definite article. So what does it look like in a sentence? Je mange de la glace. So I eat ice cream. In English, you can say I'm having some ice cream, or you can skip the some and just say I'm having ice cream. In French, it is not optional. You need to say du la glace. You cannot just say je mange glace. That would be wrong. Or, for example, voulez-vous du café? You're saying du café. And that is a construction that is just used in French and that you're going to be able to use with confidence once you've gone through a few of those iterations. As in, you've seen it a few times, you've kind of encountered it a few times, you've used it a few times, you've heard native speaker use it, you've said it yourself. It's going to be easy once you get enough exposure to it. It's just something you need to be aware of in the French language and see when it pops up. One of those things that are kind of about getting used to is the negation in French. It's not just like in English you use not. In French you use n'est pas, and they have the verb in between them. So je ne sais pas. You just need both before and after the word, you need this negative particle. And it's just something that is very easy to get used to, but it is a peculiarity of French. Something that is a bit tougher, at least for me it was a bit tougher to get used to, are I and un. They also have their respective versions in Italian, so if you are an Italian speaker, you're going to be able to understand them much easier. They correspond to ci and ne, so if you know Italian, that's going to be a breeze for you. But for me, it was like I was learning French and Italian roughly at the same time, so not as easy. And let's give an example. I usually replace a place. So it'll be like je vais à Paris or j'y vais. You can just, so this I replaces Paris in this case. Or in the phrase il y a, there are, again, you see that I that kind of replaces this, just gives you this thought of a certain place that it's, is this pronoun that is replacing that. It can also replace like a whole concept or thing. Like your friend tells you, for example, oh, there's this, I don't know, I'm thinking all day about this huge client that we lost at work. You can say that you also think about it. You can say, je pense toujours. In this case, I replaces this whole concept that your friend just told you about, the fact that sales are down or whatever, or you lost a client, whatever. I used an example, I forgot. And is very similar because, for example, somebody can say, j'ai du frère, je n'ai Dieu. So, un would replace frère. Je n'ai Dieu. Another peculiarity of French could be the verbs avoir and être, which I use quite a lot, in particular in the formation of the passé composé, which is kind of like the present perfect in English. When you say I have worked, as you see in English, the verb that you use to form that tense is have, which would be like the French avoir, but in French, and again, that is also in Italian, so if you're familiar with that in Italian, that will also help. But in French, avoir and être are two verbs which can be auxiliary in this case, and you can form in this way the past tense. So avoir as an auxiliary verb is usually used with avoir and être, and also with transitive verbs, that is verbs that take an object, whereas être is usually used with the reflexive, the passive, certain verbs of motion. And there's actually a list of those words of motion that use être. I'm suggesting chunking, I'm suggesting coming across that in phrases, learning those phrases, using those phrases, rather than trying to memorize which verbs use être and which verbs use avoir, because after you have enough French input, that just comes out from the inside. It's just something that you don't need to think about. It's about exposure. So again, it's one of those things that I would say you need to know beforehand, so you know that different auxiliary verbs can help you talk about the past. And once you know that, you're gonna notice, next time you hear or read French, you're gonna notice what verb takes avoir, what verbs take être, and over time you're gonna be able to get used to that, I promise. And speaking of tenses, another thing that is very important that I'd like to conclude these peculiarities of French with is that there's so many and that you don't need them all. Many tenses are just in grammar books or in fiction where, you know, the author wants to use a very complicated language, whatever. Most tenses that you need in French are just, you know, the present, say the passé composé is very important, so is the future. You know, it's just like very few tenses that are actually used in everyday speech. You don't need to know every French tense, every form of the subjunctive, every form of the conditional. Really pay attention to what you come across in the text that you read, in the podcasts you listen to, in the movies you watch, and just you're gonna pick up those tenses that you're gonna see in the input you use. And let it be that. Don't memorize every single tense from a grammar book unless you really like that, in which case go for it. So I hope this gave you a little bit of an overview of the French language in terms of like the peculiarities of the language. I think it's good to be cognizant when you're learning French that these things exist. Why? Well, as you have seen, there's a pattern here so that you can actually be aware of them. And once you're aware, you can notice them, and then you're going to be able to internalize them and use them instead of learning them by heart from a grammar book. It is very good when you're just about noticing, and through a lot of exposure, it's gonna sink in when to use what. But if you have a certain aspect of French that I didn't cover, because just want to give like the most important ones, but if there's another one that you think is important and you have trouble with, ask me in the comments and I'll give you my thoughts on like what I believe and like how to tackle it and like how I think it can be learned more easily. The last French topic I'd like to cover is what variety to learn. With French, I don't think that it matters as much. I gave my opinion on what Spanish variety to learn unless you have strong preferences, but on French, I just don't believe that there is that big of a difference in terms of like what is going to be easier for a beginner and what is not. Obviously, for any language that has a lot of dialects, a lot of varieties, a lot of regional accents, etc., I recommend to go for one that comes from the country that you have a passion about, or the country with which you need to do business, or the country in which you have family. Something that you have a personal reason to. If you have no personal connection or big passion about any of the French-speaking countries and you're just wondering which one do I learn, I think that again with French, just use materials from wherever. Even within countries, there's so much dialects and differences, it's insane. And French is not a language like Portuguese, for example, where Portuguese, I think almost anybody finds Brazilian easier than European, for example. But with French, I don't think that there's this kind of like what is best for beginners recommendation of objectivity. So just go whichever one you subjectively like more. And in the absence of subjective factors, just pick whichever one you can find resources for. It doesn't really matter as much, I believe. Again, that's just my 2 cents. But I would say for some other languages, it matters much more what variety you pick in terms of ease of learning and of use. So that's it. That was my master guide of the French language, how to learn it, what makes it special, etc. If you have any other questions that I didn't cover in this video, feel free to comment. I will answer any and all questions you might have. And I would love to engage with you in the comments and to help anybody that's learning the French language. I know that it can be a kind of a tougher Romance language than others, but at the end of the day, it's about getting used to it. So it's not impossible. Just keep going and keep learning, and one day it's going to happen. I promise. It's not that difficult as it seems at first glance, but I just wanted to have that video that summarizes all the peculiarities so that you know what to expect and you know what to pay attention to. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell if you want to know when I upload the next master guide on another language that I speak and that I would like to create this kind of tips and tricks for. And until the next video, bye bye, I will see you soon.